So anything you might want to know about your own practice or about how we practice or about the Buddha's teachings or the suttas, you're welcome to ask at this time. For those who may be just joining in, then we started this at 5 a.m. Pacific time is when this live stream started. And that period, 5 to 6 a.m., was worldwide Mettā practice that was happening. So various Dhamma centers from around the world were coming together, and there was people would sign up for different 1-hour slots. So we signed up for that particular slot. This group is out of Malaysia, so it's 5 a.m. our time. It's corresponding to 9 p.m. their time, and so that's one thing that's helpful for the practice of metta, or the practice in general. If you know that other people and other places are doing it, then it can be easier to get ourselves to do these different practices. And with the metta practice, it can be especially difficult or daunting when we think, how can I even, if I'm just practicing through the afternoon, dealing with possibly unpleasant sensations or tiredness, how can I possibly practice metta? But I think it's coming back to that idea of connection, that reading we did this morning of Luangpo Viradamo, The Contemplative's Craft, that it's not the quality of the experience that's important, but it's the awareness of it, or the being able to be present for the experience, whether it's pleasant or unpleasant. Because that's the whole thing about mindfulness, is if we attach to the experience, if it's pleasant, or if we try to push the experience away if it's unpleasant, then that's just compounding the issue, compounding the problem. So it starts with the sense of connection. It doesn't mean that we're necessarily experiencing pleasantness all the time, and then that's when we can have metta. But we can develop that sense of goodwill from the base of any type of experience, as long as we're not attaching to it or pushing away. And there's that paradox that non-attachment is connection. Non-attachment is alignment and connection. So that type of connection, we can also calibrate ourselves by, when we start the metta practice, by actually spreading metta to teachers or people who have benefited us in some way in our spiritual practice, in our spiritual life. That's said to be one way to calibrate our metta, is actually it's not that we're spreading metta to our teachers because we necessarily think they need it or want it, but or that we think they're suffering in some way, but we spread metta to them as a way of calibrating our own metta. And that's said to be very effective, depending on, say, the teacher you actually think of when you're spreading the metta. Questions?
Thank you for suggesting sending metta to individual countries. I enjoyed doing that, all the countries that I had a fond feeling for, and other countries too. And then I started doing groups like children and sick people and prisoners, things like that. It was very enjoyable.
Which countries were you spreading metta to?
England, and the monks over there, Holland, Germany, South Africa, Mexico, Canada, U.S.
Very good. Is Nibbana a Dhamma? One Pali dictionary describes Dhammas as objects of mind, including the created and the uncreated, which to me seems to be saying Nibbana is a Dhamma. Could you please explain? Maybe that's one for Ajahn Cunda.
I don't know. I think that one of the important things, though, with that question is that we can glean and try to understand as best we can what the Buddha taught about Nibbana, but because for those of us who have not entered the stream, it's not really possible to know it we can just make an approximation or an understanding of it through our own practice. So answering a question like that, I think a Pali scholar would know better than I. But in terms of I would guess the answer would be yes, but I could be wrong. But it's Nibbana to me is that it's an experience that one has in terms of what awakening is, but it's not anything that we could really describe or that we could explain, I think, especially somebody who, like myself, is not awakened. But if you stretch from your own experience of meditation, if one has at least been practicing for some time and has had some understanding, some glimpse of what awareness is, of what a sense of suffering is, of when there is, in your own experience, an end of suffering, and I'm not meaning the end of suffering, but an end of suffering, then you can have a sense of what that might mean, a sense of what it might mean to not suffer, for that to be the only permanent quality. And that's what we can say Nibbana is. It's the only permanent thing that the Buddha said a human being could really experience. And so in terms of knowing what Nibbana is, I think it's a good question, and it's a good thing to ask ourselves, but I think we need to really, each of us, approximate it in our own experience. The Buddha described it as non-suffering, as the end of suffering, and it's also the end of rebirth. So it's the end of becoming. It's the end of that constant searching for more sensual involvement and more of a sense of me and mine. So in your own experience, if you can approximate this, then to me it makes more sense to think about that rather than whether Nibbana is a Dhamma or not. It's more like, what is your sense of what you've gleaned around what Nibbana is or is not. So just like, for example, if one has ever just been aware of the breath and there really isn't any other further experience of a sense of becoming in that moment, you're not searching for anything, you're not desiring anything. And this is not like being sort of spaced out or anything. This is incredibly tuned in to one's own experience. And so having just that experience, even if it's just for a few moments, one can get a sense, oh, okay, is there suffering here? Is there suffering in my experience? And you can ask yourself that. And then you can see what is it that's present for you in that observation? And in that way, I think it's helpful to really compare the Buddha's teachings on Nibbana and how he explains Nibbana to be. And so even though for those of us who may have not had an experience of awakening or stream entry, that would mean that we have to approximate it. We have to kind of really try to get a sense of it through our own practice. And in that way, I think it's possible. And for me, it's a bit more of a useful way of questioning what our understanding of Nibbana is. So that's my answer to the question.
Sadhu. Yeah, I might add a little bit to that whether or not it's a Dhamma, it is described, Nibbana is described in many places in the suttas. There's one of my favorite descriptions is the 31 similes for Nibbana. So they say like the end of suffering, the beyond, the ultimate, the island, the true reality, and so on. So there's all these similes for Nibbana. And also etymologically, it means to cool off. So we can use those descriptions, those ideas, to get a sense or develop a feel for Nibbana. There's another one from online. I experience strong energy on the left side of my head while practicing meditation. How do I practice Anapanasati while it's going on? Yeah, sometimes this happens where people experience pressure in the head while practicing meditation, particularly as the mind isn't thinking as much and it seems to be getting a little bit concentrated. Then some people will experience a lot of pressure in the head. And I remember I experienced this at one time where it was more pressure in the center of the head, and I thought it was actually a sign that I was getting more concentrated, but actually it was getting more tense. And sometimes the way we hold the meditation, it's actually that type of pain in the head that arises while meditation. It's actually coming from tension, even though we aren't able to see it. It can be subtle tension, which is more coming to the surface, and then we can actually use the Anapanasati to breathe into it and actually try to focus on it and consciously relax it. So I actually had this view that when the pain was coming about in my head when I was meditating, that it was actually coming from getting more relaxed. And I remember I was at Birkin one time and I asked Ajahn Sona about it, and he said, no, that's tension. And I was kind of like, no, it's not. It's actually coming from relaxation. But then when I investigated it, actually he was right. It was coming from tension, and from focusing on it, I was able to consciously relax it. And things got a lot better after that. So I had this idea that I was actually peaceful, but I was adding tension. I thought that getting concentrated, that's why concentrated maybe isn't a good translation for samadhi, because concentration implies this kind of scrunching the head or adding tension, whereas we want to be relieving the tension. So Anapanasati can be very useful for that in terms of, actually it seems like it's happening when we're relaxing. It's kind of hard to see. But if the pain is coming up only when we're meditating, then more often than not, it's actually coming from tension. It comes from the way we're relating to the meditation, where we're actually relating to it with tension, thinking that we need to kind of clamp down and control the mind. Whereas really what we need to do is give the mind some wiggle room and allow it to settle in a natural way. So Anapanasati and the focus on the breath is a really good way to do that. I'm not sure if this will apply to the questioner's particular situation, but that's how it was for me. I think you just said non-attachment is alignment and connection. Could you please say more about that? I don't have the Lumpur V book next to me now. I could reread it, but that was just quoting him from this morning. It's a bit of a paradox. Do you have any thoughts on Cunda? Non-attachment is actually connection.
Yeah, I wasn't here for the reading. Yeah, it's an interesting thing, because you'd think that it would be the opposite, that connection is attachment. But I guess the way I would approximate that is that connection is when we are actually more aligned with our own experience of awareness. We're not sort of dividing and moving with our mind or kind of absorbed into an object or something like that. So it makes sense to me that, we could kind of think of when we feel connected, that there's not an actual sense of attachment or clinging going on. And that's quite hard to describe, but it makes sense to me more along the lines of, like, if you ever feel like you're having a very pleasant or good experience in your meditation, there's usually a dropping of self to a certain degree, and a dropping of desire. And so if desire is no longer creating conflict within the mind, then you can feel more really connected to your own experience. So it's often that we can feel disconnected by confusion and delusion and all of the defilements that fall in there. We feel divided and not really like we have a clear sense of knowing or understanding. So when that's dropped, then I do think that there is more of a feeling of connection. We can not necessarily think of how that connection works with, like, other people, but more how connection works with our own experience with ourselves. And so all of that confusion that occurs with me and mine, and how I think about the world, and how I think about myself, and what I'm going to have now or in the future, or what happened to me in the past, when all of that gets dropped, we lose that, all of that attachment that we have, it's dropped, and then we feel very connected to the present experience and what we're able to see very clearly. So that's how I would kind of connect the two, non-attachment and connection.
Yeah, and I think it's also worth saying that it was in the context of connection versus alienation.
Yeah.
So it's like we feel a sense of loneliness or alienation, and we're seeking connection. And the alienation comes from attachment and clinging. And so in the reading, it was, how do we get from A to C, i.e. alienation to connection? And that paradox of, we think there's something in us that we think through grasping and clinging at things we like and pushing away things we dislike. That's how we're going to get connection. But it's actually through letting go, letting be that we feel connected.
Yeah, and people sometimes say they have a hole in themselves and they need to fill it. But what people are often filling themselves with is things that are more attaching.
Yeah, more distractions.
Yeah.
And i.e. becoming more alienated from our own experience. There's a follow-up to the Nibbana question. I think I wasn't clear. I'm trying to understand Dhamma and how inclusive it is or not. I think what this is because the question originally was, is Nibbana a Dhamma? But a capital D was used, and I think maybe you meant to use a small d. So like there is Dhammas, that's small d, and those are any sets of ideas or teachings in the Buddhist teachings. And then there's the Dhamma with a capital D. And the Dhamma includes Nibbana as well. It includes everything. So there is the Dhamma, capital D, and then there are sets of Dhammas, small d. That's how it's generally presented in the teachings. Do you have any advice for practicing Mettā in a caretaking role? You've done this before, right?
Well, I would have to I think it depends on the caretaking role, of course. So in one way that we relate to it in a caretaking is like with a family member. I think that's a lot easier because in a sense you do have a relatedness to a family member. So obviously if it's like I think Debbie would actually be really good at answering this, but we do have a sense of strong connection with those that we've grown up with, whether it's siblings or our parents. Sometimes that can be a repelling connection. We can feel repelled, but oftentimes we can get a sense of gratitude around those that we've spent much of our lives with. And so in terms of like caretaking, it's like tuning into those things that are more positive to us, because with Mettā, I guess one of the things I wanted to say is it's very easy to turn towards the negative for many human beings. It's just very easy to become critical or protective of ourselves and again, alienating from others. But that's just a movement of mind. It's a particular place that we tend to go to. But when we actually move into a sense of the opposite, we try to highlight all of those things that we're grateful for, that we're happy for with another person, that we, just like we want to be happy, that they want to be happy, we can kind of identify those things, and we can also try to remember only the good, or try to remember the good that we have from those people who we're taking care of. I remember an answer one time with somebody who said that they only felt negativity towards their parents. And I don't know if it was an abusive situation or what it was, but I think one of the things that someone said was that, well, you can at least be grateful for your mother having carried you, for 9 months. That was something you can at least be grateful for, even if you can't think of anything. And it's hard to imagine there wouldn't be anything other than that to be grateful for, but even that, we can find some way to be thinking kindly of another person. When it's not a relative, when it's somebody who we're just caring for, maybe that's our job. That depends on the situation, and sometimes it takes a lot of incredible sort of heroic energy in order to maintain Mettā, because sometimes the caretaking role can be incredibly difficult, and the people who we take care of can be very painful to actually live with and experience. And so in that way, I think it's really helpful to try to identify like the suffering in that other person. So we have to, it's helpful to actually come from a sense of karuna. And when we really can understand from someone else that they're suffering to an incredible degree, then we can have that compassion for them, and that natural Mettā can arise. But when it's taken on personally, as if like this person's offending me, and I feel like this is a personal thing I'm taking on from this other person, then we really can't access Mettā, we can't access karuna. So just recently I had something where I only was feeling, for the most part, compassion and caring for a person, and then later on I found that they had a very negative story going on about me. And so I examined that, I tried to look at that from like, well, there is a very slight feeling of defensiveness there, but I could see very clearly the delusion in that. I had no ill will or any negativity towards this other person, and they had unfortunately come up with a fairly delusional response towards me. And so we have to be careful about how we are creating a story for another person in our minds, like when we're caring for somebody or we're just dealing with another person who's aversive or very difficult for us. Because often we take it personally and we see it as like, there's something wrong with me and we want to protect ourselves and defend ourselves. Whereas if we just keep trying to turn the picture around to them and understand their own suffering, then we make ourselves much more available to them. And then we can identify, just as we suffer, their suffering. So we have a kinship with them as well. So anyway, those are just some of the ideas that came to mind with that question.
Okay, we have another question here. Is a teacher or retreat required to keep progressing in your anapanasati practice? Depends. Yeah, being with teachers and taking retreats is helpful. I would think the main factor is that you keep doing it, that you keep practicing, and that, a teacher, it's helpful and necessary to a point, but then we have to take those teachings we've received and then put them into practice. And it's not really necessary to be with the teacher all the time. You receive the teachings. You think of like Ajahn Chah was with Ajahn Mun for 3 days, but considered him his main teacher. But he took the teachings away and put them into practice. And so we might have heard teachings from teachers, but then it can take a lifetime to put those teachings into practice. And yeah, retreats are helpful, or just finding time for yourself to be able to do the anapanasati practice, or joining little day-longs like this. Any way you can stay connected to the practice is going to be very, very helpful. And then also holding that attitude of what is progress. Sometimes it's hard to know what progress is. Sometimes the meditation, we might label it as not going well, but actually some real catharsis and healing is happening with our mind. And we might actually be making progress, but we don't realize it. In terms of, it's like I think of anapanasati and practicing meditation, particularly longer periods of meditation, can be like a mental detox where all of the mind junk food that we've been eating, or all the sense impressions we've been taking in, and reacting blindly in various ways to those sense impressions, then that'll bubble and percolate up during the meditation. And really, that's a type of purification for the mind, just being aware of those things, being mindful of those things, even though it can be quite unpleasant at times. And so what we call progress is actually quite slow, and it's more defined by like the falling away, what falls away from the mind. What are we able to let go of? Is there a lack of clinging and grasping, and are the mental proliferations becoming less stuck to us? Are we able to drop them more easily? Are we able to have a mind like water that flows into any situation more easily than in the past? So that'll be more, are we suffering less? Do we get less reactive, less angry at things that used to make us upset? Do we get less upset now? That's progress. So we don't really define progress by, being struck by a lightning bolt of insight, or having an experience of such intense bliss that it's almost unbearable. And those types of things can happen in the meditation, but it's how are we holding them? We might have an experience of intense bliss, but then if we latch onto it with really intense attachment, then the mind's going to go off the rails really quick. So progress, it looks like having to back up and define what even progress is actually a sense of ease and well-being in the mind, in a state of normality, and can be even through every situation. That's like how we would define progress. So if we're able to practice in a way that is happening, that's great. That's good. And keep going.
I just wanted to say that, it's important to think about, a couple of things the Buddha said about also kalyanamitta, and not necessarily a teacher, but having others and not going it alone. And so, one of the things that has been repeated many, many times is a sutta where the Ananda is just saying to the Buddha that he thinks that the Sangha, spiritual practitioners, are half of the holy life. And the Buddha say it's not so. The Sangha is the whole of the holy life. And so if we think about that, the Buddha really does place a great importance on being around other spiritual people, being around other people who are practicing the Dhamma. And so he also echoes that in one of his statements where he says that in order to realize the first stage of enlightenment, a stream entry, one has to hear the voice of another. And the voice of another is, we can either translate that as the Buddha, or we can translate that as an enlightened being, so an enlightened person. And so there's also, he said that what's required is also yoniso manasikara, which is a particular way of seeing through the Dhamma, seeing our experience through the Dhamma. So it's just important that if the question is more about like kind of going it alone, I think that's a pretty hard way to go about Dhamma practice. It's possible to get an understanding from reading the suttas and being very clear, but having others who have actually practiced and put the Buddha's teachings into practice is incredibly helpful. So if one can find others who one trusts and can have a way of guiding us, then that's very beneficial, I think.
Sadhu. Another one, we have the near enemy of metta is pity, is what I've heard. When metta is being developed, sometimes you see someone suffering, you want to say something. Is that appropriate or right speech? What do you think?
Yeah, I guess there are two questions, right? So it seems like one is about pity, and maybe if there was a question about that, I think that goes back to a little bit what I was saying is with
like P-I-T-Y, pity. Like
yeah, with karuna, there's a sense of connection with the other person because you're identifying your sense of suffering with their sense of suffering. But with pity, it's not that way. It's like, oh, you poor thing, and so there's a sense of them being separate from you, that you don't suffer in the same way they do. And so my sense of pity is it's more like such a pity for you, I'm so sad for you, but I don't know what you're going through. So I think that's one of the ways of thinking about how it's they said far enemy, is that right?
Near enemy.
And then with the sense of like whether it's right speech to, say something to somebody, yeah, I think that depends on your motivation. So if your motivation is to tell somebody that they should stop being sad, then that might not be the nicest thing to say to somebody. It's like, well, you're sort of telling them how to be, or you're trying to necessarily fix them. But if you're witnessing their own sadness or their difficulty and you're feeling connected to them and wishing them well, wanting them to be well, without putting a condition on it, like you better be well, there's a different sense of that, So it's just like the wishing of wellness, that sense of metta with right speech is like there's not necessarily an attachment to the outcome of that person being something for you. It's more of just a wish for them, a wanting them to be united with the good, to be happy. And I think in that way that if your speech is aligned with that for another person, then there's no problem with expressing that. But I think sometimes with speech we do have to be careful of our motivation and really check ourselves, like, well, is that really metta or is that really karuna I'm coming from? Is this an unconditional wish for another person, or am I putting conditions on it?
Ask a question about your practice, but I'm going to do it in a way of my younger beginning self practice. And it's metta-related, and interestingly enough, metta has been, maybe not so interesting, has been one of the most difficult things for me when I first started practicing. And so when I came here and the quadplex was made, he put me in the metta kuti to think about it. And it was very, very challenging. I can't articulate how it changes over time, but it does. And so what I'm saying to my earlier self is be patient. One of the things that I noticed personally is self-metta, but there's the old adage of fake it till you make it. So may I be well, may I be happy, may everybody well, may everybody be happy. And so the question, what I'm saying to myself is, with time, even though you can't articulate how it happens, it certainly does happen, and it's almost a letting go. Is that what you experience in your 23 years in ropes?
Yeah, definitely. Patience and metta are connected for sure. And in many places in the suttas, patience is the direct antidote to anger also. So, and patient endurance. So Kanti and metta are connected for sure. Kanti and metta are connected. Those are two of the paramis. And patient endurance, it doesn't just mean necessarily putting up with something and hoping for it to go away. But the patience is the willingness to be with the unpleasant. So we're coming back to that sense of connection again. So that willingness to be with the unpleasant and the relinquishment of the resistance. And so that's one way we could think about metta, goodwill for ourselves, is that sense of being able to connect with any mode of experience rather than just, I want only this experience. I don't want to have that experience. I don't want to have that unpleasant experience. So I'm going to do whatever I can to avoid that unpleasant experience and just have the pleasant experience. So that's picking and choosing to the quality of experience again. It's just back to the same thing we've always done. But with Kanti, it's actually being okay with any experience. Yeah, I actually experienced this after the sauna the other day. Got a really bad headache, and well, I didn't have a bad headache right away, but I woke up at about 1 a.m. with a really bad headache, and it was one of those headaches where it's like it was just excruciating, and I really wanted it to go away. I really wanted it to be my head to feel better, but I ended up having to just take it as the object and just say, okay, well, what can I do here? And kind of moving my neck around a bit and then focusing on the sensation in the head. And so I could have grabbed my head, just kind of lost myself in the pain. But okay, well, let's just look at the sensation and how bad is it really? And yeah, it's really unpleasant, but I can be with this. I can be with this. This is endurable. And so I just laid there for a while, and I just took the pain as the object, and the breathing got more comfortable, and I kind of woke up a little bit more, and it got better. It started feeling better. So I think sometimes just we develop when we're able to have Kanti, or we're able to be with the unpleasant, it does actually start to get more pleasant, it seems. So it's we don't want to attach to the pleasant, but that mindfulness and the patient endurance with the unpleasant does actually make it trend toward the pleasant. And that's I'm grateful just to be able to have those tools in the toolbox, I guess. And metta for oneself is also, it's for most people, it's quite difficult. For myself, I didn't think at first I didn't think it was necessary. I thought, this is kind of, metta, I want to do the real practice. Metta is for sissies. I don't need to do that. I know that's kind of a weak practice. But actually, it's the strongest practice. It's like in these readings of the Sakya Samyutta, it's that's the real strength is when we can endure. The real strength is when we can have goodwill. So it took me 9 vasas to start to realize that and try to cultivate some metta for myself. And it was difficult, but yeah, there was, when I was able to genuinely wish myself well, there was kind of a heart-opening experience. And it was, it's really important, really crucial for all of us as practitioners to get to that point if we want to stick with this. Otherwise, we'll just keep bashing our heads into a wall. And we don't, we can only do that for so long before our head gets tired. and we don't want to, because the wall's not going to give way. So we just have to stop pounding our head into the wall and start wishing ourselves well. So that kind of answers that.
One of the things that reminds me of, as you were talking about that with patience, was like if you come into this hall, there's often a feeling of warmth and gratitude for how pleasant it is in here in terms of being very quiet. But that's for most of us when we're spending time in here at 5 a.m. and then 7 p.m. But if you're here after those hours and you come in and you are expecting a quiet sit, then you can be really quite rattled when you find that incredible amounts of aversion are more than you could imagine are towards these obnoxious birds that are, like tapping and tapping away all afternoon, sometimes in the morning. And so there can just be a lot of, there are teachers. For me, it's like it's a teaching. So this afternoon, I was just feeling quite coming in here when it was quiet, and then all of a sudden the tapping started, and I was imagining how nice it is for the people on Zoom. They can just turn their mics off. But for us in here, like there was really like, okay, there are times when I'm caught in thought worlds and that's not a problem, but when actually there's a sense of being very aware, then there can be a lot of aversion and anger that comes up with this kind of thing that, or this a being. We're associating this noise with another being. And it's, why won't you stop? I'll do anything. And can we trap these things? Can we bring them somewhere else? Can we put up something that will stop them? And it was anything except just like, as Ajahn Nyaniko was describing, like, Kanti is being with rather than figuring out some way I don't have to be with. And that sense of metta just wasn't there until I just said, right, okay, this is the teaching right now, as it has been before. This is my desire for quiet and silence is actually inverse to the dukkha that I'm experiencing right now. And if I just allow a woodpecker to be a woodpecker, there's nothing personal there. There's nothing they're doing that's wrong. This is they were born into this. And so then there's that quality of openness, and also a sense of really like, wow, well, if I could really we were talking about progress, like experiencing a woodpecker and just have real equanimity and only love for them. Just imagining that, as you were saying, Skip, like fake it till you make it, just like imagining the love for this bang, 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 this just not stopping. And that's possible. So if we imagine that for ourselves, we can imagine that there's also a way to get there. There's a way for us to experience the welcoming of that and not getting so caught up in that aversion. And remembering like, oh, wait, there's some gratitude I can have right now because I can allow these woodpeckers to be my teacher. And then I can feel, I can actually generate some kindness to them. And also, as Ajahn Nyaniko was just talking about, not having to bang your head against the wall, we can also recognize the difficult state that must be to kind of want to do that all the time, incessantly, and not have really much of a choice. So all kinds of good things can arise out of that, and I think that a possibility for recognizing metta and then seeing how we can kind of bring it into our own lives.
Sadhu. Okay. I think that's good for today.